What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Sorcerer Healer. So the Sword Healer is pretty much in the same spot that it has been as of the last few patches, in the fact that it is a nice option to go for when it comes to healing rolls, mainly because mag sorcs kind of aren't really the top DPS any longer, or they're still very good. They're not the best magic DPS, and you still kind of want to have those additional synergies from Liquid Lightning. And so you still want to have a Sorc in group, but because they're not really good tanks, and Stam Sorcs are not great DPS, and Mag Sorcs, while they are pretty good DPS, they're not the top DPS compared to like Stamina Necromancers. The only other place to put a Sorc would be as a healer. So that's kind of where Sorcs kind of fall in line right now. They are really good healers. They definitely bring a little bit of interesting flavor to the table, just because they don't have many class abilities that are kind of centered around healing. So it's definitely a neat challenge to kind of play a Sorc healer here. So, just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build yourself. I will be talking a lot about different sets you're going to have on hand as a healer. So a healer in ESO kind of centers more around support, and a lot of that support comes not just from your skills but also from your sets. So I'm talking a lot about these different sets that you're going to want to run, as well as the different abilities that you're going to want to have on hand to swap in and out as the situation needs. And of course, healers do not have a DPS parse, so we won't be talking or doing a DPS parse. Instead, we'll be talking about the philosophy behind healing, kind of what you want to have in your mind while you're healing. And then I'll also have some links down in the description below to a couple of people who main healers in endgame content, just because I don't really heal too often when it comes to vet trials and even 4-man dungeons. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So again, this is just one of many different combinations of gears in the game. There's a lot of different sets that you want to have on hand as a healer, and I will be going through each of them in turn. Starting off first with our Monster Helm, we're going with Bogdan the Night Flames. This is a base game Monster Helm set that comes from Elden Hollow 2. In terms of raw healing potential, there really is no other Monster Helm set that really comes close to Bogdan. Perhaps Earthgore in terms of raw amount of healing done per proc, but Bogdan, when you consider the fact that it's an AoE heal, can blow Earthgore out of the water, especially now that Earthgore only heals one person at a time. So, very easy set to get, and definitely a nice Monster Helm set if you want a very strong heal. Even though it only has a 5% chance to proc, each individual heal you do has a chance to proc Bogdan. So if you happen to throw down a Healing Springs and you manage to hit 6 people, that's 5% chances to proc Bogdan. So it actually has a really good uptime, and again, it is the strongest Monster Helm set in the game. You can see here 3796 health every 1 second, so pretty strong Monster Helm set. There are a few other Monster Helm sets that we'll touch upon in a few minutes here that you're also going to want to have on hand. For our first set, we have Olorime. This is the perfected version here. You can also go with the imperfect version if you'd like. The difference there is the max magicka armor bonus on the 5-piece. The perfect version comes from Vet Cloud Rest, the armor from +1, +2, and +3, the weapons from Vet Cloud Rest in general. The jewelry comes from +2 or +3. So you do need to have a pretty solid team in order to get the perfected version of Olorime. Again, if you cannot get through Vet Cloud Rest, then the imperfect version of Olorime that comes from normal Cloud Rest is perfectly fine to run. You will just have slightly less max magicka. So Olorime definitely surpasses Spell Power Cure in terms of kind of utility, and it's pretty much is the main way to get major courage. Now, Spell Power Cure is only really used if you don't have access to get Olorime, or you're still farming Olorime. Once you get Olorime though, Spell Power Cure is definitely not a set you want to have on hand anymore, just because Olorime is far stronger. There's been plenty of videos made by a lot of endgame healers, and myself included, in kind of that group, to kind of showcase why Olorime is stronger than Spell Power Cure, so I'll not belabor the point any longer. The second set that we're running is going to be Infallible Aether. This is a base game set. This comes from any of the 3 Kraglorn trials here. So while the armor bonuses do seem to be more oriented towards DPS, the 5-piece is better suited to be on a healer rather than a DPS. For the 5-piece, your fully charged heavy attacks deal an additional 903 damage. Your enemies you damage with your fully charged heavy attacks are afflicted with minor vulnerability for 10 seconds. Now, even though the wording says fully charged heavy attack, it actually doesn't need to be fully charged. It can be sort of, as long as you begin the channel, you will be able to inflict that minor vulnerability. Now, as a DPS set, this is actually not all that powerful. The additional 903 heavy attack damage is not that great. Heavy attack builds, generally speaking, are significantly weaker than light attack builds by a pretty noticeable margin, so most magic DPS are not going to be running heavy attack builds at all. The light attack builds are just a lot stronger, so it kind of falls more onto healers to run this set instead, because you will be heavy attacking primarily with the Rest of Staff bar in order to get that major mending from your Rest of Staff passives there. So it falls more for healers to run Infallible Aether rather than DPS. Before we talk about the other sets, I do want to talk about jewelry traits, armor traits, enchants, and things like that. So on our back bar, we have an Infused Crusher enchant on our Lightning Staff. So Infused, generally speaking, is the way to go for your Lightning Staff back bar. You just want a little bit stronger enchant, and you want more enchant procs. The most common enchants that I've seen on the back bar are going to be Crusher enchants. If you are running Crusher, sometimes tanks should be running Crusher instead, and the Shock Damage Glyph. The Shock Damage Glyph helps proc Concussed, which is required to set enemies off balance. Sometimes Magic DPS will be running Shock Glyphs, but if you have only Stamina DPS, then you will need to run that Shock Damage Glyph. You could also, again, run that Crusher Glyph instead, like you see here. Those are your two main enchant options, and because of those two enchant options, Infused is typically the enchant, I should say, the trait that you want your Lightning Staff to be in. Now, the Restoration Staff, on the other hand, you have a few options when it comes to enchants and traits. You can still stick with Infused if you'd like. You can go with Power like I have here to increase your healing done. You can go with Defending for some more survivability. You can go with Nirnhone, that increases your spell damage, which boosts both your healing done and damage done, so kind of a little bit of a benefit there. So you have a lot of different options when it comes to traits for your front bar set. For enchants, very similar, you have a couple of options. So you can go with a weapon damage enchant like I have here. This just helps boost your spell damage to improve your heals. You can also go with, for example, a weakening enchant to help reduce the damage that's incoming to the group. You can, if you want to, run an Absorb Magicka enchant to help out your sustain. You can even run a Crusher Glyph if you so desire, although you will ideally have to have an Infused trait Restoration Staff if you want to run something like a Shock enchant or a Crusher enchant on the front bar. If you go with Charged, you could also make use of that Shock enchant on the back bar, because if you have Charged on the front bar while your enchant is proccing on the back bar, it does affect the probability of getting that concussed status effect from that Shock damage enchant if you have a charged front bar there. For jewelry traits and enchants, most healers are going with Arcane as their jewelry trait. Just gives you more max magicka, gives you stronger heals, and gives you a little bit more max resource pool for some additional sustain. Then you have couple of options for enchants. The two most common are going to be either spell damage or magicka regen glyphs. So generally speaking, the enchant that you're going to want to put on your jewelry is going to be reflective of the sets that you run. Some sets have more spell damage, other sets have more magicka regen. The general rule of thumb that I go with is I want to try to hit at least 2000 magicka regen and 2000 spell damage before all of my buffs. So if I have lower spell damage than magicka regen, then I will use a spell damage glyph. If I need more regen, then I will go with a magicka regen glyph. If you're running as an Argonian, you could also use the potion cooldown glyph if you want. That reduces the cooldown of your potions by 5 seconds. Argonians can make use of the potion cooldown glyph because they get 4000 magicka health and stamina back whenever they drink a potion. So the more potions you can drink, or I should say the less time there is between potions, the more sustain you can get by using the Argonian passive there. So that's really only limited to Argonians to make the most effect. You could theoretically use it on any race, but Argonians will definitely make the best use of a potion cooldown glyph. For our traits and enchants on our armor, on the other hand, I like to go with Divines on my small pieces with Max Magicka enchant and Infused on my large pieces with Prismatic enchants. It gives me a little bit more health, a little bit more stamina to play around with, so it gives me some more survivability. It allows me to use Clockwork Citrus Fillet for additional Max Magicka instead of Orzgar's Red Frothgar. You could also use Divines on your large pieces as well if you don't want to get the additional bonus on your prismatic enchants. That's perfectly fine as well, but generally speaking, you want to run either Max Magicka enchants on your small pieces and either prismatic or Max Magicka on your large pieces here. Infused on large or Divines on large, but definitely Divines on small pieces. Now moving on to other sets that you're going to want to have on hand. We've been going through them in relatively alphabetical order, so just bear with me while we go through all of our sets. There's quite a few sets that you want to have in your inventory as a healer. Starting off with dungeon sets. The first set I want to talk about here is going to be Sanctuary. This is a base game set from Banished Cells, so this increases the healing received by 12% for you and up to 11 group members within 10 meters of you. While this might seem like a good set to run as a healer, what you'll find very quickly, especially as you get into harder and harder content, is that healing received is not particularly useful because it's actually quite easy to overheal in this game. Now, overhealing basically means the amount that you heal for is less than the actual damage that somebody has taken. A good example of this is your matriarch might heal for 11k, and your tank is missing only 8k health, so you heals for the 8k, but then the rest of the 3k from the 11k heal is basically wasted. You've overhealed. And so it's very easy to overheal in this game. It's very easy to get very strong heals going, so having the healing received is not very useful in most scenarios. Now I say most because there are a few fights where Sanctuary is going to be useful. For examples of this would be something like Cloud Rest, help combat Baneful Mark and Execute, and if you are healing the ice prisons in Lakesti's hard mode, Sanctuary is also nice for that as well. So while a niche set, it's still particularly useful in those scenarios where you need to run Sanctuary. The next set is going to be the Worm's Raiment. This comes from Vault of Madness, another base game set here. The 5-piece reduces the cost of your magic abilities for you and up to 11 group members within 28 meters of you. This provides some additional sustain for your magic DPS and you as a healer, and it also helps out your tanks because a lot of tank moves do use magicka. Now obviously if you have a lot of stamina DPS, Worm is not going to be quite as useful or as strong, so if you have 8 stamina DPS, then obviously there's no reason to run Worm, and then you would drop it. But for most progression groups, Worm is still a nice set to have on hand. Then we have Jorvuld's Guidance. This comes from Scale Caller Peak, so now we're getting into the realm of DLC sets here. So this comes from the Dragon Bones DLC. This increases the duration of all your major buffs, minor buffs, and damage shields you apply to yourself and allies by 40%. So really nice to have on hand as a support role. It basically boosts your minor prophecy that you give out as a Sorc from 20 seconds up to 28 seconds. But the main reason that you're going to run Jorvuld's is to boost the duration of major force from your Warhorn. So the base duration is 9.5 seconds. With Jorvuld's Guidance, it is boosted up to 13.3 seconds instead. So it gives you higher major force uptime, which results in higher DPS overall. So that's the reason why you would run Jorvuld's Guidance. From there, we're going to move on to, I believe the next is going to be some Overland sets. Not many of them. In fact, I can't really think of any Overland sets off the top of my head that you would want to run as a healer. Let's see here. I don't believe there is really any that are good for healers. No, not too much here in Overland sets. Going over our trial sets. The only one that I would probably consider running as a healer would be Reflected Eye of Navintas. This comes from Sunspire. The 5-piece, when an ally activates one of your synergies, you and the ally who activated the synergy get 12% cost reduction for non-ultimate abilities for 3 seconds, and this can occur every 6 seconds per target. So you can pair this with like Worm or Hircine to get some really nice sustain bonus, but it is a little bit limited just by the fact that it lasts for 3 seconds and there's a 6-second cooldown, and it is relying on somebody to activate your synergy. It is very nice for your own personal sustain, but in terms of sustain for your allies, it's not really that great. It's a little bit lackluster, kind of mediocre. It's a set that you can definitely have on hand, but don't anticipate using it for really any sort of trial too much here. Now there are a few medium armor sets too that you might want to consider running. Really there's only one, and that's going to be Hircine's Veneer. So Hircine's Veneer is basically the stamina version of Worm's Raiment, so it reduces the cost of stamina abilities by 4% rather than magicka abilities. Now this is a medium armor set, so you do need to have access to jewelry crafting in order to research arcane, in order to transmute the jewelry from Hircine's Veneer, and you cannot obviously use the armor pieces because they all come in medium armor. So you will need to get jewelry and weapons in order to get Hircine's Veneer and use it. Very similar to Worm's Raiment. Instead of magicka DPS, it helps out stamina DPS, so if you're running in a very magicka DPS heavy group, so for example like Cloud Rest or Asylum, then Hircine's Veneer might not be as useful and you can drop it from your healers. For your Monster Helm sets, There are a few must-have sets that you're going to want to have on hand here. Starting off first, going from the very top and working our way down. First one we want to talk about is going to be Sentinel of Rkugamz. So this is a base game set here. Weaker heal than Bogdan, but it makes up for the weaker heal with some additional stamina regens. This comes from Darksheep Caverns 2. Base game set, so I have a 10% chance to proc on any heal, and it summons that spider that heals for, in this case, 1143 health, and restores 524 stamina to everybody within 5 meters of the spider itself. So really, really nice for if you have a lot of stamina DPS, and even if you don't have stamina DPS, having the additional stamina is always nice for dodge rolling and blocking on magic DPS, because they don't really have as much stamina to play around with as stamina DPS. But you'll primarily be using this in groups with stamina DPS. If you, again, very similar to Hermesine's Veneer, if you're running with a lot of magic DPS, Sentinel is not going to be quite as strong. Moving on, we have Earthgore. Earthgore has definitely seen a nerf in Elsweyr. It has been changed to affect only one target in the area rather than all targets in the area for that heal. It will remove all enemy placed effects, but that reduction in healing strength is definitely a big nerf to Earthgore in PvE. Still useful in some scenarios like Cloud Rest, potentially in Asylum, but overall not particularly useful. You can get this from Bloodroot Forge, so you do need to have access to the Horns of the Reach DLC in order to farm for this set. Moving on, we have, where is it? Symphony of Blades. This is a very powerful sustain set for healers. This comes from Depths of Maltar, so you do need to have access to the Wrathstone DLC in order to grab this set. So when you heal an ally who's under 50% of their primary resource, you grant them Meridia's Favor, restoring 23-25 magicka or stamina, whichever maximum is higher every second for 6 seconds. So really strong sustain tool. Even in 4-man content, when you're the only one running it, it's definitely noticeable for your DPS sustain. And if you pair it with a lot of other support roles in trials, so if you have like 2 or 3 of these sets running in a trial scenario, your DPS can definitely feel that additional sustain. And that just allows them to spec more into just raw stats rather than having to concentrate a little bit more on regen. So for example, stamina might be able to run buy stat food rather than regen food. Magicka DPS might not need to run False God's Devotion, and they can run another more powerful set. So definitely a strong set to have on hand. That's it for all of our sets. Moving on to our character sheets. I am a Breton. Bretons are among one of the best options when it comes to races for healers. So Bretons get 2000 max magicka, 100 magicka regen, and they get 7% cost reduction to their magicka abilities. So really, really strong regen potential here with the Bretons. Other options include Argonians and High Elves. So Argonians don't get quite as much max stats. They get 1000 magicka and 1000 health. But they do get, I believe it's 8% additional healing done. So really nice bonus to raw healing strength that way. Plus they get that, I already mentioned it earlier, that 4000 magicka health and stamina back whenever they drink a potion. It doesn't matter what kind of potion it is, they always get those resources back. So very nice sustained bonus there as an Argonian. And finally, we do have High Elves, the Ultimer, and also the Dark Elves as well. Both of these races get some additional max magicka. High Elves get 2000, Dark Elves get 1875, and both races get 258 additional spell damage. So that increases their overall healing strength, very similar to that of Argonians. In fact, it's a little bit stronger than what the Argonians get through their healing done passive there. So if you also want to play DPS on the side, High Elves and Dark Elves are considered to be the best racial options for magicka DPS. So if you want to do a magicka DPS, then you should go with a High Elf or a Dark Elf. For our resources, our attributes, we have all points into magicka. Now we are running the matriarch here, and we are also running prismatic glyphs, which gives us some additional health. So we don't really need to put any points into health here. You can see our health with the matriarch out is 18,750-ish, and if we decide to take off the matriarch, if we desummon our matriarch here, you'll see that our health drops down to 17.6k health. Still a pretty nice amount of health to play around with. And we are running regen food. We're not running Orzgardred's Frothgar, so if we were to decide to run Orzgardred's Frothgar instead, we would get even more health. So again, really no reason to put any points into health, but if you want, you can shift a few points into health to improve your survivability that way. For our Mundus, we're going with the Atronach here for the additional magicka regen. You could also go with the Ritual for some additional healing done. So those are your two main Mundus options, and so you can kind of play around with your stats depending on the Mundus that you choose. So if you go with the Aether, for example, you don't need to invest as many points into magicka regen. You can shift some points into spell damage. You can shift a couple of focus, whether that's like jewelry, enchant, or sets, into spell damage that way. For food, Clockwork Citrus Fillet. This gives you max health, max magicka, magicka regen, and health regen. Now note that we're able to use Clockwork Citrus Fillet because one, we're a Slork, and two, we also are using prismatic enchant. So if you're using max health magicka enchants, you might not be able to use Clockwork Citrus Fillet. Your health might end up being a little bit too low. In that case, you would want to run something like Earthgore's Red Frothgar instead. That gives you 5,000 max health and I believe 459 magicka regen instead. So you will be giving up some max magicka, but you'll be gaining a lot more health and a lot more magicka regen if you use Earthgore's Red Frothgar. Now we are a vampire, so we're stage 3 vampire right here. So we get access to the Undeath passive, which is some damage mitigation when we fall below 50% health. We also get the 10% additional magicka regen, so really nice bonus to our regen here as a vampire. You don't have to be a vampire if you don't want to. Healers, generally speaking, will have plenty of magicka regen. You can see right here, we're sitting at 2,500 magicka regen, and we can, if we decide to drop vampirism, we'd still be sitting at around 2,300 or so magicka regen. So not particularly necessary, but definitely a nice bonus nonetheless. Just vampirism, you do end up having lower health regen and you do take up more damage from fire. So just keep that in mind if you decide to be a vampire. Moving on to our character sheet. Starting off with our resto bar, we have energy orbs, Comet Prayer, Illustrious Healing. You can also go to the other morph healing springs. Twilight Matriarch for the burst heal, and then we have Efficient Purge. This is a flex spot here, and you can also argue that the Matriarch is a flex spot as well if you don't need that really strong burst heal that Matriarchs provide. Our ultimate, this is another flex spot here. We're running Absorption Field. It's actually a very nice heal over time ultimate there. For our back bar, this is the I forgot I need to change that morph there, but this is our Lightning Staff bar here. I just need to change the morph of Lightning Flood to the other morph, which is Liquid Lightning. You do want to run Liquid Lightning, not Lightning Flood like I have here, for the additional duration there. Even though Lightning Flood does have a larger radius, the actual synergy activation area doesn't change between the two morphs, so you just go with Liquid Lightning for the increased duration. Then we have Blockade of Storms in order to help proc our enchants and proc off bounce. We have Dark Conversion. This is not just for our sustain, but is also to help proc the Minor Prophecy from Exploitation. So we do need to use a Dark Magic ability, and none of them are really all that great except for Dark Conversion here for the additional regen. We have to double slot Twilight Matriarch if we're running it. Then we have Overflowing Altar. This is another flex spot here to replace with some other abilities. And finally we have Regressive Warhorn. This is a very strong ultimate to run, but as a Sorc, you could also run a different ultimate. You could run the Greater Storm Atronach instead. In groups that have 3 Warhorns already going, so this is mostly in trial guilds, having the Sorc healer run Greater Storm Atronach actually ends up being a better DPS boost if your DPS are hitting very high numbers. If your DPS are hitting relatively lower numbers, then the 4th Warhorn is going to be a little bit better. Now, in terms of other flex abilities you want to have on hand, Empowered Ward is a really nice shield. So I personally don't like to run the Light Armor shield as a Sorc. I prefer to run the Sorc shield, either Hardened Ward or Empowered Ward. As a healer, you should be running Empowered Ward for the Minor Intellect buff. It's just a lot more useful than the additional 10% health that you get from using Hardened Ward instead. So run Empowered Ward there. If you want just raw max magicka, you can always slot Bound Aegis here. It also gives you Minor Ward, Minor Resolve, which gives you a little bit of additional survivability. Under Storm Calling, not really too much here when it comes to abilities here. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Sorcs don't really have very good healing abilities in their class abilities. Under the Restoration Staff line, there are 2 abilities that you might want to consider learning. First one's going to be either Rapid Regen or Mutagen. Both are really solid heals for 4-man content, and they do see some niche use in 12-man content as well. Just you have to cast it more times to hit everybody, so not used quite as often in 12-man content. The other other ability is going to be either Healing Ward or Ward Ally. So this is a nice burst heal, particularly Healing Ward, if you just double cast it there. So that can replace your burst heal. Another potential burst hero would obviously be something like Comet Prayer, or even stacking Springs or Illustrious healing down. But if you're running the Blackrose Prison Staff, then the Healing Ward or Ward Ally is definitely an ability you want to have learned. Under the Destruction Staff line, you also want to have Elemental Drain on hand. Typically speaking, only one healer will need to run Elemental Drain, but obviously that healer could be you, so just make sure to have this learned just in case you are assigned to run Elemental Drain. Already talked about light armor abilities. I don't really like running the light armor shield, especially because Sorc Shield is a lot better. Under the Fighter's Guild line, Circular Protection, either morph. I personally prefer Ring of Preservation for the minor protection. Very useful in certain fights where you're going to be stacked for executes, so for example Assembly General or Lakesti's hard mode to help combat the static AoE damage. Circular Protection is very nice there for the additional mitigation. Not much on the Mage's Guild. If you want just raw max magicka, again you can slot something inner light. Under the Psijic Order line, Mend Spirit is actually fairly decent now as a heal. It is a toggleable heal, so you just toggle it and your light attacks and heavy attacks will end up being healing moves. Instead, you can still weave abilities with them. Actually got a very nice buff in Elsweyr. It also grants Major Ward, Major Resolve to anybody you heal using this. So if you want just pure raw healing strength, then Mend Spirit is very, very nice ability to have on hand. You will need to have access to the Psijic Order line in order to run this skill though. Then you have any ability under the Unlimited line, except for obviously Inner Rage, because that is a taunt. The Overflowing Altar, you'd run this for the Mana Lifesteal and the Blood Feast synergy. It's very, very nice burst heal and additional synergy for Alkosh. Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy to help deal additional damage. Still pretty powerful synergy for bow builds. Bone Surge, one for the shield, but primarily for the major vitality that comes from activating the synergy itself. And we already talked about Energy Orbs being a very powerful heal. This is actually the strongest heal in the game when it comes to raw healing done per second. Then on the Alliance War, you could also run the Replenishing Barrier ultimates as a front bar. We already talked about Efficient Purge here as a potential flex spot if you need to purge any negative effects. Both abilities will give you the additional magicka regen if you have the magicka aid passive there. Finally, for our champion points, CP cap is still 810. They have not changed it yet, so you still have 270 points to put across each of our different constellation types here. Starting off with our green CPs, and I will hit the redistribute button because our blue CPs might be off by a little bit. We have 100 Arcanist, 75 into Tenacity here, so that gives us 95 remaining points. We have 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, and 33 Warlord. You can play around with green CPs a little bit, so for example you can drop Arcanist down to 75, gives you 25 remaining points to play around with. You can also increase Tenacity up to 100 to gain 1% additional magicka restoration when you do your heavy attacks. For blue CPs, as I suspected, I did not readjust my blue CPs. The two blue CPs you definitely want to max out are going to be Blessed and Elfborn, so healing done and critical healing done. So obviously you want to max them out as a healing class. The other CP nodes are geared more towards DPS, so you can really put them really wherever you like. So for example, you can do something like 12 into Spell Erosion, you can do up to, let's see, 43 into Elemental Expert, then you can put the rest into Thaumaturge here, 15 into Thaumaturge, or you can drop it to 13 and just increase Spell Erosion to 14 like that. And finally our red CPs, so this is a very general approach to red CP, so this will give you very decent mitigation, but it will not necessarily maximize mitigation across a single piece of content. So we have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that is pretty much it for build. Oh, nope, I forgot one very important thing. That's going to be unique restoration staff. So let me quickly pull all of these out here. Starting off first with the Master's Restoration Staff, which really hasn't really seen much use since probably, I'd say, maybe around Horns of the Reach or so. So the Master Restoration Staff gives stamina back with the initial heal of Grand Healing. That's either Illustrious Healing or Healing Springs. Back when Healing Springs and Illustrious Healing were the primary healing morphs, the Master Restoration Staff was actually very useful. It was also one of the only unique restoration staffs in the game at that point, so obviously it was very nice to have. Staves didn't count for 2 armor pieces back then, so Very nice way back in the day, back like in Homestead and Morrowind. Now, however, due to the fact that staves now count as 2 pieces and the introduction of more unique restoration staffs, Master Restoration Staff has kind of fallen behind. You don't really use Illustrious Healing or Healing Springs as your primary healing source anymore. The stamina return is definitely very nice, especially for a group with a lot of stamina DPS. But your primary healing is going to be coming more from Combat Prayer. It's going to be coming from Energy Orbs, less so from Healing Springs and Illustrious Healing. So Master Restoration Staff, not quite as strong as it used to be. You can still definitely get this though. You can get this from Dragonstar Arena. You have to do it on Vet. The next one is going to be the Maelstrom's Restoration Staff. So this one, when you critically heal for regeneration, so that's either rapid regen or mutagen, you restore 800 magicka. So this basically helps out your sustain. Could be very useful in 4-man content and in those niche scenarios where you might be running this in 12-man content. So for example, in Cloud Rest as the kiting healer, you might want to run mutagen or rapid regen in order to continue to heal while you're kiting that Crushing Darkness around, in which case it'll help out your sustain, but it's not particularly strong overall compared to the other 2 restoration staffs that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes here. Next, we're going to talk about the Asylum Restoration Staff. So the Asylum Restoration Staff is definitely one of the best restoration staffs in the game right now. That is the unique restoration staffs, I should say. So when you cast Blessing of Protection or Combat Prayer in this case, the cost of your magicka and stamina healing abilities are reduced by 30% for 3 seconds. Now the perfect version reduces it by 30%, and this is dropped from Asylum hard mode, so that is Asylum +2, or from the leaderboard rewards. The imperfect version drops from any other configuration of Asylum, and it reduces it by 27%. So not that big of a difference overall. So if you can't get the perfected version, the non-perfect version is perfectly fine to run. This really helps out your sustain. Classic combo is to do Combat Prayer and then 2 orbs in order to get that cost reduction on orbs, because orbs is a fairly expensive ability to run. So very nice, really helpful for your overall sustain. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Blackrose Prison Restoration Staff. So this comes from Blackrose Prison. You can get the perfect version from Vet, and the imperfect version comes from normal Blackrose Prison here. You will need to have access to the Murkmire DLC in order to farm for the restoration staff. The perfect version gives you that magicka regen, the imperfect version does not. So the perfect version is actually quite a bit more useful than the imperfect version, but they both have the exact same second effect. So Steadfast Ward, otherwise Ward Ally or Healing Ward, applies Major Vitality to your target for 3 seconds. So some niche uses here. So Major Vitality is a very powerful healing buff to have on hand, and the fact that you can apply it by running Steadfast Ward or Ward Ally, which you can actually quasi-control who gets the shield there, is very powerful in certain scenarios. So for example, Laquesti's hard mode and in Cloud Rest to help combat Baneful Mark, it's a particularly strong staff to have on hand. So I highly recommend trying to pick this up for PvE content. Now that's all the build information. So now we can talk about kind of the philosophy behind healing. In my eyes and in ESO in general, healers are less about raw healing done per second, so less about HPS and more about support. So that's buffing your allies and debuffing the enemies. And while you might say, well, you're a healer, you should be healing, a lot of the abilities that you use to buff your allies or debuff the enemy actually have a healing component associated with it. A good example of this would be Combat Prayer. So Combat Prayer gives out Minor Berserk, Minor Resolve, and Minor Ward. Very powerful buffs, particularly the Minor Berserk for DPS. But it also has some heals. So you can see here it heals for 5933 health for you, and it's an AoE heal, so it heals up to 6 people. So yes, Combat Prayer heals, but it also provides additional buffing. So that kind of fulfills both roles that the healer needs to have, the ability to heal and the ability to buff as well. Energy Orbs as well help provide support. It's a very strong heal over time. I already mentioned that. You can see here about 1000 health every half a second. Very powerful heal, but it also has that combustion synergy, which returns resources to anybody who uses the synergy. So it's a very strong heal, so you'll be using these a lot in order to, pepper the field with energy orbs to get that healing done, but you're also helping out your DPS and your tanks with resources by using energy orbs. So as you can see, buffing, debuffing, and healing kind of go hand in hand here in ESO with the way these abilities work here. Now, I already mentioned that Sorcs don't really have any sort of strong healing class abilities, the only one really being the Twilight Matriarch. The Matriarch is actually one of the strongest burst heals in the game. mainly because it is a it's a very strong burst heal, but two, it is a 360 heal, so it's able to heal pretty much anyone around it as long as you're within, I believe it's about a 28-meter radius where you can heal people. So really nice heal, one of the strongest burst heals in the game. The downside is that it does end up taking up 2 slots, one on your front bar and one on your back bar here. The general rule of thumb that I go for when healing is obviously 1, stay alive, 2, heal your allies so they don't die, and 3, buff and debuff. So as a sword healer, another thing you are going to want to remember to do is to drop Liquid Lightning on the main tank or whatever tank happens to be running Alkash. So that just gives them the conduit synergy, which helps proc Alkash. So it's important to make sure you're dropping that Liquid Lightning where the tank is, or in the case of Sunspire, whatever stamina DPS happens to be running Alkash. So definitely want to keep that up as best you can. It does last 12 seconds, so it actually lasts for quite a long time. So you don't need to really recast it all too often here. The other thing you want to make sure to do is recast Dark Conversion every 20 seconds at the very least in order to get that Minor Prophecy. Now, if you have all stamina DPS, you don't need the Minor Prophecy, so you can just drop it entirely and put in another flexibility there. But if you do have magic DPS, you're going to want to run this every 20 seconds. The good thing is Dark Conversion's duration is 20 seconds, so when it runs out, you know you have to reapply it. Beyond that, it's basically just maintain your buffs, make sure you're running Comet Prayer for the Minor Berserk on your DPS, you gotta make sure to do that every 8 seconds, and then energy orbs out for the resources as well as the healing. I personally like to make sure I have at least 1 orb out on the field at all time between myself and the other healer. That just really helps, 1 with the healing, and 2 gives DPS and tanks an opportunity to get some resources back as soon as their synergy is off cooldown. But it's a little bit hard for me to describe healing without actually showing you guys healing, and I don't really heal too often on live. I'm more of a tank and DPS player, so I do have links in the description below to a couple of people who main heal in vet trials. So I have Sophie, Tabitha, Heals the Fields, and Style Anima. All 4 of them do heal at the high end levels of endgame rating, so feel free to drop them a question or 2 if you guys have questions about healing on their Twitch stream, or in the case of Style Anima, her YouTube channel. Beyond that, if you do guys have any questions about this build or healing in general, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability, but if I can't answer them, then I will try to find somebody who can answer and relay that answer back to you guys as soon as I can. Hope you guys found this build and video informative, hope you guys enjoyed the build, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.